legal experts heard of their dispute and saw how well Jesus answered them. He came over and asked them,
"Which commandment is the most important of all?"
Jesus replied, "The most important one is Israel. Listen, our God is one Lord, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is, you will love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these." The legal expert said to him,
"Well said, teacher. You have truthfully said that God is one, and there is no other besides God. And to love God with all of the heart, of full understanding, and all of one's strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is much more important than all kinds of entirely burnt offerings and sacrifices."
When Jesus saw that he had answered with wisdom, he said to them, "You aren't far from God's kingdom." After that, no one dared to ask him any more questions. And from Matthew we read, "The day Jesus went out of the house and sat down beside the lake, such large crowds gathered around him that he climbed onto a boat and sat down. The whole crowd was standing on the shore. He said many things to them in parables. A farmer went out to scatter seed. As he was scattering seed, some fell on the path, and birds came and ate it. Other seed fell on rocky ground where the soil was shallow. They sprouted immediately because the soil wasn't deep. But when the sun came up, it scorched the plants, and they dried up because they had no roots. Other seed fell among thorny plants. The thorny plants grew and choked them. Other seed fell on good soil and bore fruit. In one case, a yield of 100 to 1. In another case, a yield of 60 to 1. And in another case, a yield of 30 to 1. Everyone who has ears should pay attention."
So once again, we hear, in just a little different context, but we hear Jesus pointing us to the great commandment, to love God with all our heart, our soul, our strength, and our mind, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. Jesus makes it clear here and in several of his other teachings that our highest calling is to love God and one another. And the fact that Jesus points us to this commandment so often tells me a couple of things. One, that it is really, really important that Jesus desires this above all else for us. To live with compassion is to live with passion, with love, and with fire. Does that describe you? That is what Jesus is calling us to do. We believe that Jesus came to show us in the flesh the heart of our God. And that heart is love. And the only right way to respond to that love is with love. The second reason, though, I think that Jesus goes back to this so often is because we don't find this all that easy to do. If this came natural for us, then I don't think Jesus would have to keep calling us back to it. Loving other people can be hard. Loving our families can stretch some of us. Loving those we don't know very well or that we don't have much in common with, or even those who are our enemies, can feel downright impossible. As we see in the questions and the statements of many of the people that surround Jesus, including even his own disciples, there is a very real human tendency to always want to put limits on this call to loving other people. We want to have an easier time of it. Who exactly is our neighbor? How many people do we have to fit into our heart? And as I contemplated that all this week, I began to wonder, as often as Jesus calls us back to this central teaching, to love God with all that we have and then to love our neighbors as we would love ourselves, I began to wonder if this call to love one another somehow permeates all of Jesus' teachings, even those that aren't expressly or necessarily about love. For instance, this second lesson that we heard today, the parable of the sower. I think this is the most common or the most familiar of all of the parables that Jesus teaches. And of course, we usually pay attention to Jesus' description of the various soils. But this week I asked myself, where is love in this parable? The first place that we discover love in this parable is the generous, indiscriminate sowing of the sower. The sower, the farmer in this parable, scatters seed everywhere. You farmers who are here today might even say this is a little wasteful. This isn't necessarily a good farming practice. But in this parable, Jesus tells everyone, no matter where they are, no matter what condition they are in, everyone is given the opportunity to receive and respond to the love of God. Now, Jesus goes on to recognize that not all people will respond to that love, not in a way that will benefit them or others. Some will refuse to let that love in at all. Some will be quick to welcome God's love only to get easily distracted by the next thing that comes along, or give up when things get difficult. Others will respond to God's love, but that love is just one of many important things in their lives, and since God doesn't necessarily clamor as loud as many of the things in our culture do, that love can get drowned out. But there is this last group that Jesus talks about. The group that Jesus wants us to hear about. Jesus wants us to know that there are those people who receive God's love, who take it in and nourish it and tend it and let God's love flourish in their lives. And those people reproduce that love over and over again. They are the ones who are able to love God back with their whole mind, their heart, their spirit, their soul, their strength, and they are the ones that will love their neighbors, whoever that neighbor might be, as themselves. They are the ones that say, if there isn't a big enough table for all the people, rather than limit who can come, let's build a bigger table. They are the ones who continually let their hearts get stretched bigger and bigger, even when the stretching is challenging or becomes painful. They are the ones who won't give up on the hard cases. These are who Jesus is calling all of us to be. As I said last week, we are focusing some of our weeks this summer celebrating the gift of creation, and especially how creation witnesses to the fundamental messages that God has for us. And with that in mind, I began to notice how often Jesus spoke about nature in his teachings. He was teaching people who lived very close to the earth. Agricultural people, fisher people, sheep herders, people who understood the importance of a good harvest or a reliable well. Jesus used the everyday stuff of life to teach people about God and life and goodness. It did make me wonder for just a minute, like, how would Jesus use computers and smartphones today to try to teach us about God? Because we don't live necessarily so close to the earth as the people in Jesus' day did. On Wednesday night when I was talking to people, I said, we can go to the grocery store and buy hamburger and never once think about the cow that hamburger came from. We buy our fruit and we put it in a bag, but we don't see the tree that fruit came off of. We aren't necessarily people as close to the earth as the people that Jesus originally taught were. And so when I read these parables that have so much to do with nature, I know that I come at these from a different mindset than the one that Jesus had and the one that the people had who first heard Jesus. And I find it helpful sometimes to read material from other cultures who are closer to the earth than I am. I have a Western scientific mindset. So do you. That's what we have all grown up with. That is the culture that we are immersed in. We are the people who ask, how does that happen? But that wasn't necessarily the way Jesus or the people he taught were. In our culture, we often see creation as a resource that we can use for our benefit, one that we need to protect so that we can continue using it for our benefit. But there are cultures around the world who have a very different understanding of nature, an understanding that isn't maybe so scientific, that isn't so practical, that is perhaps a bit more poetic or instinctive. And we really don't have to look very far to find such a culture. Native Americans in our own country see creation as having the ability to teach us lessons that we need to learn. Robin Wall Kimmerer is an environmental scientist, a botanist, and a Native American. So she has a rather unique ability to meld or weave together through two very different understandings about nature, and to write about it from both of those understandings, from her scientific point of view, but also from her Native American roots. And one of the chapters in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, is called The Council of the Pecan Trees. And I read that chapter this week, and I learned a lot about pecan trees that I never knew before. Have any of you grown up around pecan trees or spent time have pecan trees in your yards? All right, Bob. Well, I didn't realize that pecan trees, like other nut trees, don't produce fruit every year. They don't do that because nuts have such a greater nutrient density. It takes much more from a tree to produce nuts than it does to produce a fruit like apples or pears or cherries. And unlike those fruit trees which produce fruit that is meant to be eaten immediately, you know, you pick the pear and you eat it, the apple is ready to be eaten, nut trees double vault their fruit. If you've ever picked up nuts off the ground, they have this hard kind of leathery case around them, and inside that is the kind of harder stone-like case which protects the fruit, the nut inside. And you have to get through both of those in order to get to the good stuff. These fruits are meant to be gathered and stored by animals for later use. In order to survive, pecan trees need to produce more than what can be gathered and eaten by the animals that use their fruits. So nut trees engage in what scientists call massed fruiting. And that means that they produce at irregular intervals. Some years they produce, some years they do not produce, and we really don't know how to predict when that will happen. Now, scientists, through studying these trees, believe that they store up starch in their root systems. And when they have a surplus of starch, then they will produce nuts. And that can happen in 1 year, or that can happen in 3 years. But that doesn't seem to completely account for the activity of these trees either, because if that were strictly the case, then you would think that a tree that is planted in rich, fertile soil would produce pecans more often than a tree that is planted in soil where it struggles to survive, but that is not the case. When one pecan tree produces fruit, they all do. There are no soloists in the pecan grove. Not one tree in a grove, but all of the trees in the grove, and not one grove in the forest, but every grove in the forest, all across the county, all across the state, will produce pecans in the same year. How do they know to do that? Scientists really aren't sure yet. And for centuries, Native Americans have believed that trees communicate with each other. And science has laughed at them for such a notion. But there is now evidence that these trees develop a kind of complex fungal network that runs between trees, between the roots of these trees, and starch travels from tree to tree through that fungal network. And so, in a testament to unity, pecan trees all flourish together. In a very real sense, they are connected to each other. Through unity, they survive. Because they all produce on the same year, they end up with an abundance of nuts, more than the squirrels and the other animals can gather up and use, so that some of those will go on to produce more pecan trees. They give of their surplus so that all can fruit and reproduce. And in that giving, their own survival is assured. Now that sounds to me a little like loving your neighbor as yourself. Over and over again, Jesus points us to an understanding that we are in this life together. That we need to discard our notions of us versus them and see only we. We are in this life together. And if we want to flourish, then we need to care for one another. Now Jesus tells us that the seed, the Word of God that is love, that seed that falls in good soil can replicate 30, 60, or even 100 times. And it is interesting to me that the amount doesn't really seem to matter. He doesn't say, well, the really good tree, the really good seed produces 100. He just says it reproduces. Some will do 30, some will do 60 times, some 100 times. And I think the point of all of that is that a seed in good soil will produce a harvest. Some people will have opportunities to extend God's love to thousands, even millions of people around the world. I think of people like Rich Stearns, who was the head of World Vision for a long time, and then the witness and the love that he was able to extend through his position went to millions of people. Some of us will have the opportunity to love hundreds of people through our families, our work, our friendships, our neighborhoods. Some of us, because of our unique circumstances, will love a few people, but we will love them well. The point is that the seed of love planted in us will produce a harvest of love. That is what God is looking for. That is what God is calling us to. The parable is clear that it is the soil that makes all the difference. And there is something in me that wants to say, why didn't the sower make all of the soil good soil? I grew up with grandparents who were farmers, and I grew up picking rocks out of a rocky field and cutting weeds out, what do you call that, walking beans. Anybody else walk beans when they were a kid? Cutting out the things that would grow up and would inhibit those beans from producing a good harvest. And I want to say, why didn't the sower take care of all of the types of soil? And the answer, I believe, is that God never forces himself on us. If we open ourselves to God, I believe God will work within us and produce good soil, but God doesn't force us to produce love if we don't want to. God doesn't force us to receive God's love if we don't want to. God is never an uninvited guest. He waits. God always waits for the invitation to come in and to work those rocks up out of our hearts, to pull those weeds out of our hearts, to prepare within us good soil. So how do we do that? How do we allow God to feed our souls so that we can bear fruit? A basic law of nature and life is that we can't give away what we don't have. Many of us have probably tried that in our lifetimes, but you cannot give love away if you don't receive love. You cannot give kindness away if you never receive kindness yourself. That basic law applies to all of us. But I think where we are unique is how we receive kindness or generosity or love or peace. Different things speak to different ones of us. We all have a unique way of receiving the goodness of God, and we have unique gifts for passing that goodness on to others. So I'm going to ask you this morning to spend the next few minutes considering what feeds your soul. What works up that soil and makes it rich and fertile in your heart so that you can nurture the love of God in your life? What fills you up so that you have a surplus to give to others? And then how do you share that love with others? How do you pass along the love that you have experienced? You've each been given a heart. I hope you have your hearts with you. If you didn't pick up a heart when you walked in, you can just use the bottom of your bulletin for now and pick up a heart on your way out, and you can transfer it. But I invite you to take a few minutes and on one side of your heart, write down what feeds your soul. And on the other side of your heart, write down how you best give that love away to others. What is your unique gift for giving away God's love? You're going to have a few minutes to fill those out while we have another song for you from Playing for Change. And this features children from around the world singing Love Is All. So that activity was a little bit quieter than the Play-Doh last week, but I hope that you took some time and thought about that. Take those hearts home with you. Stick them someplace where you'll see them. Pay attention to what nourishes your soul and allow God to do that for you. Pay attention to where your unique gifts can be used by God to spread God's love around. We are convinced that we need many, many things, but Jesus tells us we need only one thing. We need love. We need to receive love, and we need to give love. And I just wonder, what kind of difference would it make in the world if all of Jesus' followers believed that love is the one thing that we need to receive and to give? Would you please pray with me? Holy God, you know the condition of our hearts as we enter into worship this morning. You know that some of us are full up, that we have been nurtured and sustained by your word, by your love, by the example of Jesus Christ, by the beauty of creation that surrounds us. So use us to bless others. Let the surplus of love that is within us overflow to bless others. You know that some of us are running on empty. Perhaps we have been distracted by many things or worried about many things. Help us to open ourselves to your love. Come to us. Make your presence known to us in ways both powerful and small. Fill us so that we too may be used by you to do the work of Christ in this world. As Jesus taught us, so we pray. Our Father, who art in heaven,